Welcome to Stars and Gripes, where we highlight those in the US media who have shred all pretense of ethical reporting to become activists. And first to the Associated Press and MSNBC, two newsrooms which have knowingly published misinformation about the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, to make it look like she is pals with Putin.
Just today, Tulsi Gabbard said that Putin and Trump are, quote, very good friends.
The Associated Press made the same reckless and false claims, leading to the story eventually being deleted. The New York Post had the details. The Associated Press has retracted a story it published Monday, which wrongly claimed that the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said that President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin were good friends. The story was false because Gabbard was talking about Trump and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, not Putin. MSNBC then had to air this humiliating correction.
Last night, we reported on excerpts of an interview between the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, and an Indian TV news network, in which she said that Trump was good friends with a world leader. We said that world leader was Vladimir Putin, but the full interview shows that Gabbard was referring to Trump and Indian Prime Minister Modi. Clear that up.
Well, as one critic of this saga noted online, the media is always loud when making the original allegation and oddly quiet when correcting the record. Let's bring in Sky News contributor Tulsi Gabbard to discuss. Tulsi, this was a shocker, and it was a shocker that you have to assume that it was knowingly done because it was so obvious listening to it and reading the transcript that that's not what she was saying at all. So the only conclusion you can draw is there's mass incompetence, or they've just knowingly verbaled her in the worst possible way.
Yes, I think that those are the two correct endpoints of the spectrum there, for sure, that either it's mass incompetence and just sort of a laziness, maybe, that the people fronting these brands rely wholly on staff to put together the talking points that they read off the teleprompter and don't do their own work or don't apply their own common sense check, all the way to the other end, that it's something a little bit more nefarious and deliberate. You know, I think the big picture is not pretty because it just underscores that much of the mainstream media is still caught up in the Russia mania, which was a big theme in Trump's first term, and that's why they were so quick to leap to that conclusion. I will say that I'll give them a little bit more credit than years past, noting that's a low bar, in terms of the prominence of the correction, because in the past, you know, whether it was a Hunter Biden laptop story or Russia mania or giving themselves Pulitzer Prizes for their reporting on the Russia hoax and all the rest of it, there were no retractions or corrections actually for many things that are still up there. Versus now, Stephanie Ruhle of MSNBC did actually use airtime on her next day's show to correct that, and the AP took down the story with a correction on the bottom, so it's not living on in the internet. I find that a little bit interesting, that it's a small improvement, but maybe Trump and MAGA world are finally cracking through a little bit and slightly shifting the way they operate in the mainstream media.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that there's been a slight switch. I think it's been more prominent on CNN than MSNBC. America is in the grips of domestic terror attacks on Tesla vehicles, but some in the media have disgustingly been cheering on this violence as some sort of legitimate form of resistance. But before we get to that, it's important to see the scale of the damage that we were talking about.
Some breaking news that we are following for you this hour, and this has to do with these Tesla attacks that we have been seeing in recent weeks. We now are learning that Attorney General Pam Bondi has announced charges against 3 people in domestic terrorism attacks on Teslas. 3 people accused of destroying Tesla cars and charging stations are now facing up to 20 years in prison for domestic terrorism. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced just moments ago. She said in a statement as well, the days of committing crimes without consequence have ended. Let this be a warning. If you join this wave of domestic terrorism against Tesla properties, the Department of Justice will put you behind bars.
If you blow up the cars of innocent, random people because of ideology, you are a terrorist. It's that simple. Even now, ABC here in Australia has conceded the attacks have the hallmarks of terrorism. But listen to the language from mainstream yet hardcore activist journalists who are encouraging Americans to resist a Trump presidency and protest a private company not even linked to the government. They call the protests remarkable and organic.
There's something really remarkable happening right now. I'm not sure people have really quite gotten their arms around this. We are seeing this organic, bottom-up movement against Musk's signature company, Tesla. Some activists just put up a website with a simple message, right? Sell your Teslas, dump your stock. And then an entire Tesla takedown movement has sprung up in response. And they've got a map where all the protests are planned all across the country. It's been happening for about a month. This weekend alone, there are more than 100 protests planned at dealerships, Tesla dealerships across the country, from Brooklyn to Toledo, Dallas to Grand Rapids, Raleigh, dozens more. There are even, as you might see there, a handful planned in Canada and the UK. And I'm going to tell you something. I wager next weekend there will be even more, and the weekend after that more.
Yes, I imagine there will be even more protests next week because MSNBC has just broadcast a rolling list of where every single one is being held and directed people to the organizers' website. Now, do you remember the outrage from journalists over people supposedly encouraging January 6 violence? These people are so blind to their biases that they do not understand the similarities here. Now, Kosha, let's bring you in because I'd love to get your views on this. I think there's a fine line between covering the story and then romanticizing with some of these protesters in a way which could give credence to the view that you want people to go there. You see this presenter talking with this sign that says resistance behind him. It's a very positive connotation towards the protests. He clearly thinks these protests are a great idea, but in reality, Tesla owners are being targeted. Teslas are being blown up. People are being charged with terrorism. It seems like an odd tone for a professional news organization to take when discussing the story.
Definitely, and that is a fine line, but it's a very, very serious line because this is a very serious matter. You know, Chris Hayes there said he finds it remarkable and organic. I would agree with him on the first part. It is remarkable, but not for the reasons he thinks. It does not appear organic. I think, I have no evidence of this, but I think it would be a safe assumption that there are these types of agitator groups and sources of funding out there. We know this, that seem to be able to flip a switch basically and unleash very much organized protests. It appears grassroots, but if you peel back the surface and it isn't, that would be my educated guess if I had to wager one. And in terms of that fine line, they need to be careful because the media, for good reason, has very strong protection, strongest in the world in America because of the First Amendment, and the bar is very high for any sort of legal exposure that any media personality would potentially face. However, here, if it does get proven that this is domestic terrorism, and Trump has said that, and Pam Bondi, as AG, has also indicated that, as you mentioned. There is a statute. It's a little bit more difficult for good reason for the president to designate domestic terrorist groups versus foreign terrorist groups, where he has a lot more leeway. But there are statutes in place. I think it's 2331 in the United States Code number 18 that actually has a definition for terrorism, and they're working their way through that in the courts. If that happens, then this becomes very serious. It gives more power to the DOJ in terms of the types of remedies and prosecutorial action they can bring against these folks. And then for Chris Hayes and MSNBC and others to be skirting that line, if you could prove that they're kind of aiding and abetting something that is actually a designated domestic terror group, that gets a little bit more dicey for them. So they might want to take that into consideration when they do this reporting.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And whether or not they are able to successfully prosecute under the definition of terrorism or domestic terrorism, it doesn't change the fact that if you had a news organization actively showing people where to protest, say, a Joe Biden presidency on January 6th, there would be outrage if the protest ended up being violent or if there were violent acts that stemmed from that. And I think that what this is exposing, I think a lot of conservatives already noticed that because there was a lot of looting and then there was already a lot of fires that didn't have the same scope of it. But what do you make of the fact that there is this hypocrisy? They don't seem to be aware of the fact that they're ignoring that distinction.
It's so true. I mean, they really are in this bubble or echo chamber where whether it was the J6 protests and riots or whether it was Black Lives Matter, just the way they've framed the issue and covered it versus the way they're covering this. It's so obvious to anyone who's not in that bubble. And, they are in a crisis of credibility, as are many institutions right now in America and all across the world. And I think the only way to remedy that, really, it doesn't feel like it can happen from the existing talent that's up and down in the organization now. The only way would be to inject new talent, new conservative-leaning voices into mainstream journalism. You're seeing them do a little bit in that direction, with the firing of Joy Reid and Jeff Bezos taking control of editorial a little bit more in the Washington Post and so on. But the next thing has to be to get other people who don't live in that echo chamber on the air in their newspaper columns to present that point of view that you just did, Jack, and that's the only way to, I think, counter that bias that is clearly such a blind spot for them, because they just only live and breathe and talk to, I think, people with very similar thinking, and they're missing out on how most of the rest of the country sees these issues.
Yeah, well, we'll keep a close eye on it. New polls are in, and it isn't looking good for the Democrats. In fact, it is so bad that my favourite left-wing talk show host, Jon Stewart, took a spray at his own side of politics.
Dems keep fecklessly complaining until the 48 approval comes down to 40, which is a plan, but it's forgetting one crucial piece of information in Schumer's popularity calculation.
Devastating, cascading poll numbers for Democrats. Only 27% of voters have a positive view of the party, the lowest favorability rating in the history of NBC's polling.
You're at 27%. You've got to get Trump to lose 8 points of popularity just for you to get to the point where you're 13 points below him. Your approval is only 7 points above, where it turns red and goes into low power mode.
Kosher, he's so funny. I really wish he was one of us. But I think that what Jon Stewart's really good at here is when he notices that there is this massive issue, and what we were just talking about with this hypocrisy and everything. The Democrats have positioned themselves, they've been wedged to being on the side of terrorists and people who are looting and burning down. It's a really untenable position for them to be in, and it's going to be really hard for them to capture mainstream America back if their position is, well, it is a legitimate form of resistance to blow up a Tesla. If that is their position, they will lose every single time.
Yes, that one. There are other 80-20 issues where they are just really throwing down on the 20%. The boys and men playing in sports for girls and women is another one. It's an 80-20 issue, including Democrat voters do not want that, but they keep throwing down. We've seen examples of this. And the other one is deporting violent criminal gang members is another one where 80% of the country, Republican or Democrat, agrees with that as a principle, as a philosophy, and they're not. So all those examples show that there is a disconnect between some of these leading indicators like Jon Stewart, Van Jones, Bill Maher, some of those guys who are a little bit ahead of the curve from the left with diagnosing the reality that's facing the party right now, but and what they're saying versus what the voices in the room and on the air are throwing down with, such as these issues that I just mentioned. And until that disconnect is closed, that gap is closed, it looks like this downward spiral is continuing. I found that poll remarkable too, that it's the lowest point, 27 points of approval, as you showed in that chart, is the lowest since the 1990s, which is the Clinton years. So it's fascinating. It's even the Obama years, which were a peak popularity for the Democrats, have sort of come and gone, and they're way back to where they were just an entire generation ago. So this is a big deal, and they've got to figure out how to regroup, realign on a message, and come back to the middle a little bit if they want to regain their popularity.
And just quickly, how do they do that if there is no willingness to move away from identity politics? You said, and I completely agree with that 80-20 issue on women in men's sports, it seems like a fundamental part of the Democratic Party. And how can the party move away from an issue that is just so toxic to the general public?
I think, the only way out of this for them is through. And they really have to have a reckoning and look in the mirror and just realign on some of those 80-20 issues and let go of the 20% of the base that's maybe more rabid and louder and squeakier and getting all of their attention. The other thing is there isn't any obvious leader in the party right now. Usually you need a leader who can do that and corral the group and reorient everybody around a winning message or two, around the working class, economics, sports, all these things. And nobody has stepped into that void. There are some familiar faces popping up, obviously, but that's another clear gap. So they need a good leader, and they have to be willing to recalibrate closer to the mainstream of American opinion.